In any case, would you please welcome Dr. LaForge?
Thank you all for coming this evening. I'd like to thank Myrna and Sonoma State for asking me to speak with you this evening, and I'd also like to thank the Alliance for the Study of the Holocaust and Genocide and Ms. Christine Davidian for helping make this happen. And I also wish to congratulate this lecture series, which is almost 30 years now. Is this the 28th year? This is the 28th. So we're almost at 30 years. It's quite an accomplishment for any lecture series, and particularly for one as important as this. And I wish you many years of success in the future with this as well. Today, I'm going to talk to you about the Armenian Genocide. I'm going to be talking about a few other things than just the genocide. I will be putting this into a historical perspective, and I'll go into that reason why very shortly. But first, I'd like just to familiarize you with where Armenia is, who the Armenians are, and the arc of Armenian history. So we'll start off with where Armenia is today. Then we'll do a quick introduction to historical Armenia and to aspects of Armenia's history that continue to be significant in the Armenian self-conception and self-identity. We'll then look at the historical context of the genocide itself and its perpetration. And then we'll finally, moving into the theme of this year's series, I'll be looking at the role of memory, and in particular of memoirs that are now coming to the fore within the study of the Armenian Genocide. So let me just start off quickly with a brief discussion as to why I feel the historical dimension is important. Okay, so to why, maybe the genocide, some of you may know, hopefully from your reading of Peter Balakian, occurred between 1950 and 1923. And you may be shocked that I'll be starting at 1200 BCE. And so one may wonder why is that necessary? One of the reasons is, first of all, the Armenians themselves have a long historical memory. History is very important to Armenians. And this is not, American history, civil wars a long time ago. No, not that long time ago. We're talking about long historical memory that goes back millennia. And it is part of the constitution of who they are today. They still refer to historical events that we consider long in the past as recent history in some cases. And this is not just true of Armenians. Many other peoples, particularly from the Middle East, but also from Asia, have that same sense of continued continuity over the generations that go back. So that's one reason why I put this in a historical context. Another reason is because although the Armenian Genocide is a defining moment, particularly in modern history, it's not the defining moment of Armenian history. Okay, and I want to emphasize that. It's a defining moment, not the defining moment. And in conjunction with that, I'd also like to say that genocide is not the culmination of Armenian history. And this is something hard to escape, but I'd like to emphasize this. Even amongst Armenian scholars, there's a tendency to view Armenian history with the end point being the genocide, with that viewpoint already there. And that's just not the case. And one of the things that I'd like to emphasize or hopefully highlight this afternoon is not the inevitability of it, but how it could have been avoided in some senses by showing that this actually is a process that's rather rapid in its development. So we're not looking here at a sort of unstoppable trajectory of Armenian history and that all of Armenian history leads up to this. No, Armenian history existed for millennia before the genocide and will continue to exist for millennia after it. And that's an important point for me. So this is part of the reason why I like to do this historical introduction. Now, geography. Here you may be able to see, maybe if they can put the lights out over here. I don't know if they can do that. But you can see here, this is the modern-day Republic of Armenia in this little corner here. This is a region in which it's situated. So you can see it's not a very large country. It is landlocked at the moment. And it has one major lake inside of its borders at the moment. This is a close-up of the modern Republic of Armenia, and next to it, the Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh. That is a republic who ethnically is Armenian. It is not part of the Republic of Armenia. It's a separate a republic that's not recognized internationally. It was occupied by Azerbaijan, and the Armenians who were living there fought a bloody war for their independence, which they won. It's still a tense situation, one of the flashpoints in the Middle East and the Caucasus. But right now, Armenians in their historical homeland are concentrated in these two areas. One, the Republic of Armenia, the other one, the Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh. Primarily, the Republic of Armenia is bordered by Turkey, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Iran. Okay, this is a tough part of the world. They have good relations with Iran, and that's about it. So it's not easy for them geopolitically. The size of the present Republic of Armenia is about 1/10 the size of historical Armenia. And we'll look at that now. If we want to take a map of historical Armenia, you can see the modern republic would be centered right over here. This is a much larger area of space. Now, when I talk about historical Armenia, I do not necessarily mean a political entity. I mean an area of Armenian inhabitation where Armenian culture and language dominated for several centuries, indeed millennia. So this is what I mean by historical Armenia in that sense. And it was roughly the size of Great Britain today. Okay, so that's a huge difference in the shape of where Armenia was and where it is today. And I can show you a comparison here, this close. You can sort of see the comparison of where the republic is here and the historic size of Armenian habitation, which would take it more around here, and particularly around Lake Van in the south. And we'll be talking about that a little bit later. Okay, who are the Armenians? Well, as with many people, this is actually a much more complex problem than it sounds. But around 1200 BCE, there are a group of people whose name may be called the Mushki, who spoke what we call Proto-Armenian, that is the Armenian language. And they moved in to Thrace and Phrygia and across the Anatolian Plateau. Here's Thrace and Phrygia, all the way across the Anatolian Plateau to what we then call Armenia. This means that they were probably around Troy during the Trojan War. And we know that the Phrygians were allies of the Trojans during that war, and it's nice to speculate about Armenian speakers sort of partaking in the Trojan War. There's no evidence for this whatsoever, but it's nice to imagine. Nonetheless, Armenian itself is an Indo-European language. That is, means it's related to Latin, Greek, Persian, English, Russian, French, Italian, all the languages that belong to the Indo-European family. When they arrived, these Proto-Armenian speakers arrived in the area, particularly around Lake Van. They mixed with other peoples who were also there. And through this admixture of peoples, we get what we can call the development of the Armenian people themselves. The Armenian language was the one that became dominant, and it also seems to be the identity that became dominant. Our first historical mention of the Armenians, that is, in physically a text saying, this is Armenia, these are Armenians, is in the inscription of the Behestun from the Persian Empire, from Darius the Great in 519 BCE. So it's even though we speculate based on linguistic evidence primarily that the Armenians settled or began to come together as an ethnic group around 1200 BCE, our first historical mention of them is from 519 BCE. Still a very long presence recorded for them. Okay. Let's look at other significant factors then, other than this long historical presence in eastern Anatolia and Armenia for Armenian self-identity. One is that we have to say that Armenian history is dotted between periods of independence or autonomy and periods of occupation, and I'll be looking at those briefly. That is, when we look back at Armenian history, Armenians have known independence. They know what it means to have their self-rule and have a society organized under their own organizational principles. They've also known what it is to be a subjective people, and so they've shared both experiences and are able and have reacted to both experiences. The second major importance is their Christian faith. Right? Armenians are devout Christians to this day. We'll be talking about that in a little bit. Previously, they had some form of Iranian religion akin to Zoroastrianism, which was the prominent form of religion up until the Islamic invasions in Iran, with sort of a syncretistic feel to it. They took in other gods from other pantheons, but mainly it was of a Zoroastrian flavor up until their conversion. Their language, they've been able to maintain their language for all these millennia, and they invented their own alphabet in order to help preserve it, and we'll be talking about that in a little bit. And then finally, the notion of homeland and dispersion. In particular, I'm going to be talking about dispersion. That is how the Armenians traveled across the globe, and how that plays an important part also in the genocide. Okay, so I'm going to be touching on these sort of significant factors in Armenian self-identity before we then turn on to the historical context of the genocide. Okay, autonomy. You can see here I put a list of monarchies, and I don't expect you to have these memorized by the end of the lecture. But as you can see, there are a lot of them, and they stretched over a very significant period of time. We can start off with the Yerevantids. They declared themselves kings at one point. And then under the Artaxerxes, or the Artaxiads, as they're known in the West, Armenia actually reached its largest expanse. In fact, it was an empire in some senses. Not only did it have independence under King Tigran the Great, who reigned from 95 to 55 BCE, but they also managed to take over and subject neighboring states. And so at this point, Tigran actually styled himself not just king of Armenia, but king of kings. This is something very sort of ingrained in Armenian consciousness. Right? People name their kids today Tigran in honor of King Tigran the Great, even though this is 2,000 years ago, over 2,000 years ago. People have maps of Tigran's kingdom in their houses. Okay, this is a very important king. Even though he wasn't Christian, he's still a very important king in Armenian consciousness. The next important one, the Arshakuni dynasty that ruled from the 1st to the 5th century CE, is important because it was during their reign that the Armenians became Christian, and we'll talk about that in a second as well. As you can see, during the Middle Ages, there were several Armenian kingdoms, but there's pretty much a long gap between the 15th and the 20th centuries, in which the Armenians did not really enjoy any sort of true independence, but were rather subjected to various rulers, and we'll be looking at those in a second. But we notice that the first Republic of Armenia was born. It lasted a very brief time, just over a year. Then it was followed by the Soviet Republic, which is known as the Second Armenian Republic. And recently, we have the Third Republic, or the current Republic of Armenia, which has been independent from 1991 till now, and the Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh, which has been independent from 1991 until now. So these are the basic periods of Armenian autonomy. Armenian periods of occupation are sort of more complex. We have them in antiquity over several different monarchies and empires. Achaemenid Iran. Briefly, the Seleucid Empire, that of Alexander the Great, didn't actually subject Armenia. The relationship there was a little bit looser. But then the Romans and the Parthians, between the 1st and 3rd centuries CE, fought constantly over Armenia. And then Byzantium, after the Christianization of the Roman Empire, and the Sasanian Iranian Empire continued to fight. This paradigm of an Eastern power versus a Western power fighting over, and when I say Eastern and Western, I mean relative to Armenia. I don't mean anything else other than that. Is one that will repeat itself through Armenian history, and it's one of the defining factors of Armenian geography that places it between these two major empires, one normally to the east, one normally to the west. If we turn to the Middle Ages, we see this then continue on into it between Byzantium and the Caliphate. The Mongols and the Mamluks, more north-south, but still slightly east-west. Tamerlane and the Turkmen, and then the Ottoman Turks and Safavid Iran. This will be a major conflict that will destroy most of Armenia's economy and encourage the dispersion of many Armenians. These were a particularly disastrous set of wars. If you look into early modernity, Armenia was controlled by Ottomans, Russia, and Qajar Iran. and in the 20th century by the Republic of Turkey and the Soviet Union, or the Second Republic of Armenia. So as you can see, Armenia has been in between all of these different areas and powers, and that has put it in a vulnerable situation often. And in the present, as Turkey it controls all of, or most of historical Western Armenia, and Azerbaijan is still in control of parts of historical Eastern Armenia. Okay, let's move on then to Christianization. As I said, the Christian faith is an important aspect of Armenian self-identity, self-perception. Christianity seems to have spread early to Armenia. By the 3rd century, by the middle of the 3rd century, about 250 CE, we have evidence that the Armenians, at least the Armenians of the region around the Latia, required a bishop. And in order to get a bishop, you need to have a significant population of Christians. So we know that around 250 CE, the Armenians already had a bishop that could overlook the Armenian Christian population. But it's not until the early 4th century CE that the process of the conversion of the Armenian peoples began. The date is debated. The Armenian Church says 301. Armenian historians say 314. It doesn't really make much of a difference. When the King Tirdat, decides to convert to Christianity, he in effect is the first ruler to make Christianity the official state religion of the country. Okay, well, as I like it, it makes it the first official religion of the polity. State is not really a good word for these periods of time, but nonetheless, Christianity starts to become identified then with Armenianness, and we'll trace this sort of progression a little bit. So, Armenia at the beginning of the 4th century is the first sort of polity to accept Christianity as its official religion. Over time, because of a variety of disputes, it actually becomes an independent church. Right? To this day, the Armenians have their own church. It's known as the Armenian Apostolic Church. The apostles are Saint Thaddeus and Saint Bartholomew, that are held to have first converted Armenians to Christianity. The patron saint is Saint Gregory the Illuminator. The church has its own head, its own pope, so to say, known as the Catholicos. The spiritual center of the Armenian Church is in the Republic of Armenia, in a place called Eshmiadzin. And it's part of a theological grouping of churches known as the Oriental Orthodox. These are different from the Greek Orthodox, and they're different from Roman Catholics. They're their own little grouping that consists of the Armenians, the West Syriac Church, Copts, and the Ethiopian Church. So those churches together form what we know as the Oriental Orthodox. In 451, the Persian Empire decided that they didn't like, this is approximately 140 years after, or 140 years after the 150 years after the conversion of the Armenians, or the Armenian ruling class, to Christianity, the Persians decided that it was not a good idea to have an Armenian Christian state within its empire, especially as the Byzantines, or the Romans, had also converted to Christianity. And so it looked like that the Armenians would therefore side, because of their religious affinity with Byzantium, against Iran in wars. And so the Persians decided to change the situation and return the Armenians to their pre-Christian faith. There was a huge battle. This battle, there were a series of guerrilla battles, and then a battle at Abaraj, the plain of Abaraj, that took place, in which the Armenian forces fought valiantly but were decimated. Nearly all of them were killed. However, they took out far many greater Persian troops than they themselves numbered. So it was what we call a Pyrrhic victory for the Persians. They won the battle, but they were so destroyed by that they had to retreat. Nonetheless, the general who fought and died there is known as Vartan Mamikonian. The Armenians who fought under him and who died there are known as martyrs. And to this day, the cathedral in New York, the Armenian cathedral, is St. Vartan's. There is a commemoration for them in the church called Vartanans, in honor of their sacrifice. And this may be the first example of military martyrdom in Christianity that we know of. It's still unclear, but this may be the first time that we have a sense developed in which Armenians died for the faith. And they actually say explicitly that we're willing to die to maintain our religious expression. The tension continued for about another 30 years until religious tolerance was granted by the Persians in 485. But it was important for the formation of Armenian identity. As I said, they're still revered to this day, but it helped consolidate the notion that to be Armenian meant to be Christian. There's no doubt that in 451 there were still non-Christian Armenians running around. After 451, it becomes more and more difficult to preserve an Armenian identity that is not linked with Christianity. Accounts of the contemporary accounts in the 5th century of the war start to frame the issue in terms reminiscent of the Book of Maccabees. And anyone here who knows the story of Hanukkah or has learned about the history of Judaism under the Seleucids, the books of Maccabees talk about how the Jews revolted against the Greeks and fought off Hellenization. And were willing to die to maintain their faith and to maintain the purity of their temple. And this narrative of a small group of people versus a large pagan force that's willing to desecrate their religion becomes part of the Armenian narrative. And again, it's one that continues to today. Armenians are a small Christian nation willing to fight to the death to preserve their identity and faith. All right, and this again will be evoked during the genocide as well, and particularly in the aftermath of the genocide. As I said, these figures are revered to this day. This is a painting, a famous painting of the Battle of Avaraya from 1953. But as I said, there are many churches, people are named Vartan, many churches dedicated to Saint Vartan. The Battle of Avaraya is commemorated every year to this day. So this is an important aspect of the formation of Armenian identity. Okay, one other aspect, the language I mentioned. The Armenians have their own language, and they invented their own alphabet in order to write in that language. It was invented in 406 by Saint Nestor Mashtots. It was primarily invented to translate the Bible into Armenian, but as soon as they did that, a lot of other works started to be translated, and a native literary tradition started. And so that means that we have an Armenian literary tradition that stretches all the way back to the beginning of the 5th century, over 1,600 years of writing in Armenian. This is the same alphabet they use today. Now, the language isn't the same today as the language spoken in the 5th century, but there is continuity, and I'll be talking about the development of modern Armenian later on, because again, it's an important development within Armenian history. So, but I want to emphasize that we're talking about, as I said, they have a long historical memory, and they have a long national written record of it. Okay, and people still read these works today. And that's an example of the alphabet. They also double as numbers. So you have the digits, the tens, the hundreds, and then the thousands in each one of those columns. All right. Armenian dispersion. First of all, Armenians always traveled. You go back to antiquity, they traveled as part of foreign armies. They traveled for educational purposes. We have stories of Armenians traveling to various cities in order to increase their education. But the political circumstances of the 11th to 15th centuries particularly encouraged a dispersion of Armenian peoples. And in the early 16th century, the Ottomans, the Ottoman Empire captures Western Armenia, and also many Armenians are brought to the capital Constantinople. There was already an Armenian community there, but Armenians will start to flock more and more to Constantinople and to Western, what we would call today Western Turkey, in search of better economic fortunes. In particular, the wars between the Ottomans and the Safavids in the 16th and 17th centuries drove Armenians to leave because the area was ravaged. So you can see here, this is the border between the two. This is the Safavid Empire on this side and the Iranian Empire, and this is the Ottoman Empire. When these forces met, they met in Armenia. So whenever they fought a war, almost, they fought in Armenia. And the local population suffered. And they suffered multiple times. One, because the army's coming in, then often again because of the army's retreating, and because of the battle itself, and because battles and wars were normally followed by periods of famine. Often the armies on the way out would burn everything behind them so that the enemies couldn't follow them deep into territory. And so as they burned everything behind them, obviously the people who live there are left with barren fields. And so not only do you have the original sort of trauma of the invasion of these armies, you have the subsequent trauma of the famines that go on often for years afterwards. So this constant warfare between the Ottomans and the Safavids encouraged many Armenians to either to go elsewhere to survive. Let's look at, in the 17th and 18th century, I just want to point out some places that might be surprising to you where Armenians could be found. So first of all, throughout the Ottoman Empire, Constantinople, obviously in historical Armenia, but then in Western Turkey, in Constantinople in particular, in Smyrna, one of the big cities, throughout the Levant, that is Syria, modern-day Lebanon, modern-day Israel, that the whole branch of the Eastern Mediterranean there, Egypt, Iraq. In the Persian Empire, there was a large community in Al-Jufa. They had been moved there by the Shah at the beginning of the 17th century, and they formed a flourishing trading community that we'll talk about in a second. And that Al-Jufa is located right outside of Tehran, right outside of Isfahan, excuse me. Ethiopia, there's a community in Ethiopia. Russia, Georgia, Eastern Europe, in the Ukraine, Poland, Romania, in Western Europe, in Italy, Venice and Rome, France, and Paris and Marseille, England and London and Manchester. We also have Holland and Belgium, particularly in Amsterdam and Bruges. We have Armenian colonies in the 17th and 18th centuries in all these places, but not only there. In East Asia, in India, we have significant colonies in Surat, Calcutta, Madras, in Burma, Rangoon, in China, Tibet, Jakarta, in Indonesia, and in the Philippines. Even two people make it to America. We have Martin Yi Armenian, he's written down as Martin Yi Armenian, who came to Jamestown in 1618, 1619, and George the Armenian, who comes around 1650. Both of them for business prospects. It doesn't seem like it worked out and they returned home. But nonetheless, this is the sort of traveling and entrepreneurship that we're seeing amongst Armenians. Why is this important? This will be important for several reasons as we move through Armenian history. First of all, they're able to take advantage of, this is an anachronistic globalization. The world in the 17th and 18th centuries, as we're moving into modernity, as people may be familiar from their European and American history classes, is becoming more international. It's becoming more globalized. Well, this is the rise of mercantilism and also colonialism. And the Armenians are able to take advantage of this. They have a trade network set up in all of these colonies. They have local people who are able to help them with the local economies. And way before Facebook, these people were on the ground, sort of being able to communicate with each other. And what's good about that has been pointed out, for example, by Sebel Islania, that they have a secret language. Who can read Armenian? The Armenians. All right, so they have a way of communicating. They have a code to communicate in. Okay, and they have cultural context too. As they move through all these towns, and I have to say they make cultural contributions. Sometimes they're the first ones to set up printing presses and newspapers and book publication in each one of these places, and some of these places are the first ones to do that. But they also learn about the cultures that they're in, and they're able to diversify their own cultural heritage that way. And they're not colonialists. At the end of the day, this will bring an end to their financial success as England and Holland are able to enforce their rule more than the Armenians are, because they don't rule at all. But on the other hand, they tended to be trusted by locals because they didn't come in with gunships. They came in, they set roots down, they made a community for themselves, and they learned to negotiate with the locals. They learned the local languages, they learned the local people, the local customs. So this gave them a very different perspective. And often the English or other colonial powers would try and use the Armenians to get inside the local culture, because the Armenians had gotten there before them and already had that foot in the door. So this gives them a different perspective on this international world than it does, let's say, colonialist powers. Finally, it increased the wealth of Armenians, and we'll see also in the Ottoman Empire, as they're able to take advantage of these trade networks, they the wealth of certain classes of Armenians begins to improve through this international trade. But they also have a global perspective. Global perspective. That will be important as we move into the 19th century, that they don't see themselves as just citizens or just as people of a particular location. They're interested in the world. They're interested in what's going on in Europe. They're interested in what's going on intellectually, what's going on culturally. Okay? And we'll see how this happens. Okay. So let's look at what it may have been like for an urban, relatively affluent Armenian, right, in the middle of the 19th century in the Ottoman Empire. Okay, let's look about around 1860. Right? You have to say, if you're looking at the middle of the 19th century and you're a citizen of the Ottoman Empire and you're a part of this urban, sort of relatively wealthy class, it is a time of hope, a time of excitement. Okay, their internal and external pressures have forced the Ottoman government, the Sultan and the government, to make certain amount of reforms. These reforms are known as Tanzimat. Okay, these reforms were intended to help improve trade, to help improve the life of minorities, to guarantee their property. Okay, this was meant to make the minorities feel more comfortable, and as I said, it was both because of external and internal pressures, but it was also intended to modernize the Ottoman state. And we have to remember that if you're living in one of these cities, such as Constantinople, not only do you have the incredible diversity of, let's say, the Ottoman Empire itself, which is Armenians and Greeks and Arabs and Turks and Kurds, but and Syrians, there's a huge diversity there anyway. But you also have the incredible diversity of European peoples as well. So you have Turkish, Greek, Armenian, Ladino, French, Italian, German. You can go on and on. And many of these Armenians, I mean, I know from survivors of the genocide, spoke all of these languages. You know, they spoke 5, 6 languages. They did dealings with Ladino. Is people may be familiar. Is the language of the Jews of Turkey. It was the Spanish that they spoke before the Inquisition, and then they were kicked out. They were accepted into Turkey, and they continued to write in Ladino. They had their own press in Ladino. There was a Greek press in the Ottoman Empire. There was an Arab press, and there was an Armenian press. Many Armenian newspapers and journals. But as an Armenian, you may have business contacts with Italians and French and Turks and Arabs and Greeks, and you had to know all of that. And they were conversant in all of these things. So it was an incredibly diverse, and I would say versatile population because of that diversity. A wealthy and educated middle class had started to develop by this time. It wasn't a large amount of people, but still it was better than anything that had happened before. Armenians attained roles in the government. Not key roles, but still more than they ever had before. Some of them ran the mint. Imperial architects, some of the most beautiful buildings of the late 19th century in Istanbul today were designed by Armenian architects. They also had important factories. Right? They controlled a gunpowder mill and a paper mill, two very important manufacturing commodities. Here we have an example. This is the Hotel Tokatlian in Constantinople. It's famous because of Murder on the Orient Express. Part of it takes place in the Tokatlian Hotel, run by an Armenian, frequented by Europeans. And he was incredibly wealthy until finally everything was confiscated. He was also forced to flee the Ottoman Empire. But there's, again, Tokatlian means he's somebody from Tokat. And this, again, is indicative. There were people who came from all over, what today is Turkey, Armenians who came from all over Turkey to Constantinople in order to make their fortunes. And this is an example of one of them. Wealthy Armenians, beginning in the 1840s, start studying in Europe. Right? If you were an upper middle class person, professional, you would send your son or daughter, you wouldn't send your daughter, you send your son to one of the Armenian schools or European universities in Germany or France or in Italy. There were some Armenian schools that were set up there, but they also went to non-Armenian schools as well. But this was a heightened interaction. Colleges opened up within Turkey itself. Particularly impressive in this matter were American missionaries, Protestant missionaries that went out to the Ottoman Empire and tried to convert people to Protestant, various Protestant sects, but also spread education. And particularly powerful was the spread of education to women. They opened up colleges for women in Anatolia, and Armenians, being Christian, were able to capitalize on this. So we have the development of an educated class. Right? Men who go to college and university, sometimes in Europe, and even women who are becoming educated. Okay? This is not happening on such a grand scale, let's say, for example, for the local Muslim population who would not send their daughters to a Christian college. So, I mean, there's a disparity that does develop there. Armenian culture and society, 1860s, booming. All right, cafe society. This is a picture of outdoor cafe in Smyrna. The vernacular language, what we call modern Armenian. In Turkey, it's Western Armenian. In the Republic of Armenia, it's Eastern Armenian. But a language up until this point in time, the classical language, their equivalent of Latin, had been the main vehicle of expression. All of a sudden, in the middle of the 19th century, people start writing in modern Armenian. Right? They start translating European literature into modern Armenian. People who were not educated necessarily in the church can now read European works, Armenian works. They start debating the language in newspapers. Poetry explodes. We get a whole wealth of modern Armenian poetry. This is known as the Armenian Renaissance, in Armenian art poem. And there's a healthy literary scene, as well as artistic scene. We get the development of Armenian theater. The first Armenian theater opened up in 1861. So we're talking about a vibrant time. If you're an Armenian in 1861, this looks like we're about to enter a much better age. Okay, this does not look like you're going to be entering into the twilight of the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. It looks like you're entering into the dawn of the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. All right, so people were genuinely excited. There were problems, but people were genuinely excited. The Armenian Constitution, which was promulgated in 1863, that was for the way the Armenians were supposed to regulate themselves. The Ottoman Empire regulated minorities according to ethnic religious divisions known as millets. So the Jews had their own millet, the Greeks had their own millet, the Armenians had their own millet. And the Armenians had a patriarch, the head of the Armenian Church, and they had to negotiate how they were supposed to govern themselves. And this constitution was a way for Armenians to regulate how they could govern themselves more democratically and fairly. Right? And also how they can preserve good relations with the Sultan. So, again, it's a time of hope and a time of excitement. So the question becomes, how do we go from here? And let's say the 1860s, this is later than the 1860s, but from about the 1860s, to here in 1915. This is the shock, and it's one of the shocks that the Armenians still have a problem with today. Many, even historical scholars, how do you go from a time in which there's so much hope and so much enthusiasm to this? Now, first of all, what I was showing you was only part of the story. As I said, that is what life was like for a rather wealthy, urban Armenian living sort of in Constantinople or Smyrna. In the provinces, it's a different story. The mass of Armenians out here are agricultural peasants, first of all. They're not as well educated, although they're probably better educated because of Protestant missionaries than their non-Christian neighbors. These here are the 6 Armenian provinces of the Ottoman Empire. The reforms of Tanzimat, right, were either not implemented or not enforced. That is, yes, Constantinople said this has to be, but what your local governor or your local village chief did was a different story. And if they violated those rules, it was unlikely that the Sultan was going to send somebody out there to enforce them. So this put them in a rather delicate situation. There was a sense of lawlessness and abandonment. And many Armenians rioted or protested, just asking for the rule of law to be established, to be enforced. There were a series of protests and quote-unquote revolts in which Armenians said, look, you promulgated these decrees, but we're not seeing anything here. In fact, what we're seeing is looting. What we're seeing here is local massacres. What we're seeing here is discrimination. All right, will you please enforce the rules that you have passed? That didn't really happen. And to add to their troubles, there's a demographic shift. While the Armenians were still a majority in the area of Van, the province of Van, and in the other areas, they consisted of plurality. Right? They were not the majority throughout the 6 Armenian provinces. That is, we have a different situation in Eastern Anatolia than, let's say, in the Balkans. Right? Where you can say that the majority of the people in Greece, in Ottoman-controlled Greece, were Greek-speaking, ethnically Greek. There was a Muslim population, but it was by no means on the same scale. In Eastern Anatolia, the two communities were much more integrated. Armenians formed the majority in Van, and a plurality in most of the other areas, but they were even a minority in some areas where it was their historical homeland. So this does complicate matters also for the situation and as it develops over the course of the reform movement. And there were signs of trouble in the Ottoman Empire itself. The Ottoman Empire over the 17th and 18th centuries encountered a series of military defeats. And the 19th centuries had a series of military defeats. They're getting pressure from the new Russian Empire that has expanded its borders, starts pushing south, wants control over the Black Sea. The Greek nation is born, per se. The Greeks achieve independence by 1932 after a series of revolts. So we can feel the pressure mounting on the Ottoman Empire militarily. Egypt asserted its independence under Muhammad Ali, who was able to rule there, basically without having anything to do with the Sultan. All right? And they start having problems financially. They're having problems competing in the international economy. They have to take out loans from European nations. Right? And they take their first foreign loan out in 1856. And the reforms themselves, these reforms that were supposed to protect and enhance the life of minorities in the Ottoman Empire, sometimes also created a backlash. That is, you had Muslims now saying, why do these Christian minorities get better benefits than we do? It's our empire. We should be ruling them. We shouldn't be kowtowing to them. Okay, so in many areas, when the rules were, when the new reforms were promulgated, there was a backlash saying, no, not only are we not going to abide by them, we're going to beat you up in order to make sure you know what your proper place is. All right, so that was also part of the reactions. And as I said, Constantinople didn't then go out into the countryside to enforce or to make sure that these reforms were being adhered to. The major loss for the Ottoman Empire, however, was in the Russo-Turkish War of 1877-78, particularly as concerns the Armenian issue. It was a substantial loss for the Ottomans militarily. They lost several important trading centers in their Armenian possessions. The Treaty of San Stefano, which originally ended the war, was particularly harsh on for the Ottomans. They were saved by the fact that the European powers did not trust an expanding Imperial Russia, and therefore forced them to renegotiate the treaty. Now, much of the lost territory, particularly in the Eastern Front, was given back to the Ottomans. But nonetheless, at the Treaty of Berlin, the Congress of Berlin. But nonetheless, this starts a bad taste in the mouth of the Sultanate, and we can see that. In the post-Berlin situation, the Sultan is worried, again, that in Western Armenia or in Eastern Anatolia, that this area will be, again, liable to invasion from the Russians. And the Sultan also starts to fear that the Armenians, being Christian, will side with them. Okay, so first of all, he gives local officials a free hand to persecute Armenians and to make sure that they are kept sort of under thumb. And he accepts the formation of these Kurdish irregular cavalry units known as the Hamidiyya. They're called Hamidiyya because the Sultan was Abdul Hamid. And these guys are basically allowed to run throughout the countryside and loot and kill Armenians at will and take their property. So these cavalry units are formed, and they're loyal only to the Sultan. The Sultan further starts to develop an anti-Christian ideology, and we start to see this emerge under him in the post-Berlin era. This idea that not only, technically all Ottomans are Ottoman subjects, but this idea that it's Christianity as opposed to Islam, or the idea that the Ottoman Empire is an Islamic empire and the Christian elements in it are a threat. The Sultan Abdul Hamid II starts to develop this sort of ideology. And Armenians begin to form resistance groups in the aftermath of Berlin. They realize that they are being persecuted, that there is no rule of law, and they start to found groups of resistance fighters. Now, these did not have any sanctioning by the official leadership in Constantinople. But I have to say, there is a huge sort of gap in understanding between the Armenian leadership in Constantinople and the reality of the situation in the provinces. That is, the Armenians in Constantinople, who, as I said, are relatively wealthy, who are doing well, are educated, are looking to preserve the status quo as much as possible. And the Armenian leadership, the patriarchate, and the leading merchants do not want to create disturbances, while the situation in the east is starting to deteriorate faster and faster. So on the one hand, we have these resistance groups forming, and on the other hand, in the capital, you have Armenian groups and Armenian leaders saying, listen, we have nothing to do with this. Okay, they're acting on their own. On the other hand, we also see the first Armenian political groups also forming at this time. Ways in which they want to work within the Ottoman framework to reform the empire so that Armenians will be able to enjoy security, right, and particularly security and the prosperity that they have earned. So we have the formation of these political groups, we have armed resistance groups, and we have people leaders in the capital who want to preserve the status quo. Very different reactions to the post-Berlin situation. But the main, the important thing for the Armenian community will be is that this war turned Sultan Abdul Hamid definitely against the Armenian millet. Up until that point, the Armenian millet had been considered the loyal millet. They'd really been considered part of the backbone of the Ottoman Empire, and their services were recognized as being loyal to the empire. But from this point onwards, we see a definite shift in at least the way the Sultan is looking at them. Okay, he knows that there were Armenian generals in the Imperial Russian Army that fought against the Ottoman Empire. There are Armenians in Ottoman Armenia who welcomed the Russians as they came in as Christian liberators. And so the Sultan starts to think of the Armenians as a fifth column, a potential treasonous group, ethnic group, who at any moment will turn against the empire and bring down its ruin. And we have to remember that part of this is also coming in after the loss of the Balkans, of Greece. Right? And after this loss to the Russians, the idea that the Ottoman Empire was going to fall apart territorially was a major preconception, or a major preoccupation, of the Sultan. So we start to see this language coming from the Sultan of treating the Armenians as a possible fifth column. This culminates in the massacres of 1895 to 96. Beginning in 1895, Turkish and Kurdish forces launched systematic attacks on Armenian villages, and it continued until the summer of 1896. Approximately 100,000 to 200,000 Armenians were killed during this year and a half. And also, importantly, tens of thousands fled. The earliest major communities in America are formed in the aftermath of these massacres. Okay, and in some senses, the ones who got out were lucky because they were able, therefore, to miss the genocide. We're still not at the genocide, and we're already talking about numbers of 100 to 200,000. This is where the situation had already developed. There were protests. The European governments protested, but there was nothing stopped it. A situation developed in which finally one of the members of the Armenian Revolutionary Federation, Babasyuni, and 25 other people hold themselves up in the Ottoman Bank and threaten to blow it up. A good reason for doing this is that most of the money of the Ottoman Bank actually belonged to Europe, so if it got blown up, they were nervous. The Europeans were also nervous; they didn't want to get it blown up. A deal was eventually reached, and they were able to get out. But as they left, rioting erupted in Constantinople, and about 6,000 Armenians were killed in the ensuing riots in Constantinople. European powers again protested. You can't do that. The Sultanate said, "Well, you're over-exaggerating. You know, people are just a little bit out of control. They were nervous about this." But nonetheless, we can see a pattern developing. Now, I have to say, by the 1890s, it's not just Armenians. Right? A lot of people are fed up with the regime. Okay, and they're not the only ones who suffer at the hands of the regime. And we do have a series of Turkish liberal thinkers known as the Young Turks. That is an umbrella name for a group of various groups of leftists or Turkish intellectuals who wanted to reform the Ottoman Empire. And they thought that the Sultan was doing damage not only to minorities, but to the Ottoman Empire in and of itself. One of them was actually the Sultan's nephew, Prince Safavids, who helped the Young Turks in the hopes of creating some form of constitutional democracy, with the Sultan as the head of the government, but with a prime minister and a normal functioning sort of democracy. We'll see what happens when this actually comes into place, but nonetheless we should mention this. It's not just Armenians who are suffering at the hands of the Sultan, who by now has sort of become a little bit crazy, but it's other people within the empire as well. And in 1907, nationalist forces who are also against the Sultan because they feel that his administration was weakening the military, combined forces with the Young Turks. Now these nationalists, they merge and they form a particular party known as the Committee for Union and Progress, the CUP. As I said, these was included within the Young Turks, but they were the particularly nationalist faction. Okay, and he becomes a major thinker for the CUP. This idea of resurrecting this sort of nationalist Turkish ideology with connections all the way across through Azerbaijan into Central Asia to the Turkic countries all the way to the Pacific. This obviously was never realized, but nonetheless we see this sort of ideology developing at this period. And in 1908 there is a coup d'etat in which Sultan Abdul Hamid II is overthrown, and the Young Turk constitutionalist government comes into power. Armenians were part of this government. They were part of the parliament. It was really the Armenians not only participated, many of them start to return. Those who had fled after the persecutions, after the massacres of 1895 to 96, start to return, unfortunately for them, because many of those who returned were later killed in the genocide of 1915. But writers, school teachers, intellectuals thought that after 1908, it was their time to help rebuild what they considered their country. They didn't want to live in exile. They didn't want to live in Europe. They didn't want to live in America. They wanted to live in their home. And they wanted to educate their young Armenians as Ottomans and give under a constitutional democracy. Right? And so they returned and dedicated their lives, and eventually they sacrificed their lives for educating another generation of Armenians. But it's hard to, I mean, we sit there like, oh my God, how can you go back? But if you look at 1908, there was dancing in the streets. All right? People thought that this had finally brought, all right, stability and a sense of democracy to the Ottoman Empire, in which people would be able to live in security and without fear. Unfortunately, this was not to be the case. Can we fix the PowerPoint slide? Okay. There are problems still lurking. And these show up, first and foremost, fairly soon at the massacres of Adana of 1909. Whose 100th anniversary was acknowledged 2 years ago now. According to the New York Times, these are New York Times estimates, in 1909, between 20,000 and 30,000 Armenians were killed in the province of Adana. Now, this was not government ordered. That is, the constitutional government did not order these massacres. However, there were certain members of the CUP, of the Committee for Union and Progress, who were involved. Particularly, there was a journalist or a guy who was writing in a newspaper who was stirring up ethnic hatred between Armenians, and particularly Armenian Christians and Muslims. And these escalated to these riots in April, and tens of thousands of Armenians were killed. Now, when the government finally restored order, there was a trial. And the government blamed reactionary forces within the empire. That is to say, at the same time, the Sultan staged a counter-coup, was replaced for 9 days, and then deposed again. So what the constitutional government said was, look, this was a period of uncertainty. There are reactionary forces that are trying to destroy the constitutional government. This is not something systemic. It's something that can be rooted out. And they tried a number of people. 124 Muslims and 7 Armenians were hanged as punishment for the violence. All right, so as far as they were concerned, they had handled the issue. The problem is, superficially, they did handle the issue. They took care of it. There was a court case. There was a trial. Right? But they've neglected or they ignored the root causes of the hatred and the idea. Why was it so easy for this to happen? That is, why did it take such little effort to get to the point where you could kill 20 to 30,000 people and not think about it? Right? No one addressed that question. What they were really hoping to do was say, okay, this is a one-offer, this is not going to happen, let's sweep it under the rug, it's not a big deal, there are reactionary elements. As long as we move forward with this government, everything will be ironed out in the end. Well, unfortunately, that didn't happen. In 1913, taking advantage of military losses that the Ottoman Empire continued to suffer in the Balkans in 1912, the nationalist wing of the Young Turks, the CUP, violently takes power. They shoot a minister, and they claim the government for themselves. The leaders of this movement are Enver Pasha, who is the Minister of War, Talat Pasha, here who is the Minister of the Interior and the architect of the Armenian Genocide, and Cemal Pasha, who is the Minister of the Navy. These guys effectively, as a triumvirate or a troika, managed to take over the government and basically install some form of martial law. Enver, in particular, is anxious to get into World War I and to be on the side of Germany. Germany and Turkey and the Ottoman Empire, it's a sort of interesting history in and of itself. You may have read some of it in The Burning Tigris by Peter Balakian, but Germany, having formed its nation-state rather late, was not able to enjoy the fruits of colonialism like France and England. Therefore, having been locked out of the colonialist game, they decided to link up with the Ottoman Empire in order to get influence in the Middle East that way. And they started to build a railroad, the Berlin to Baghdad Railroad, that's still there today. They also started to send troops there to train. And in fact, as Myrna mentioned, it is possible that there were German troops stationed at the Ottoman Empire during the genocide who learned about the paradigm or the tactics of genocide during their stay there. And then later imported it or helped bring about the Holocaust based on what they had seen and learned. Based on what they had seen and learned in in the Ottoman Empire. But Enver was Germany was less and did not necessarily want the Ottoman Empire to side with them in the war and enter into it, but they really wanted to. Enver in particular, and what he really wanted to do in order to live out possibly this pan-Turkic dream was to retake territories that were lost in the east, plus the Caucasus, and create a continuity between Turkey all the way into Azerbaijan and into Central Asia. In any case, he starts a massive campaign out to the east. And in January of 1915, his army is decimated at the Battle of Sarıkamış. Now this, it was a horrific campaign, and people froze to death, they starved to death, in addition to the military casualties. It was quite horrific. And on the way back, Enver starts to develop an excuse for this horrendous loss of life, which is that the reason why they lose this battle, and the reason why they lose this campaign, is because the Armenians betrayed them. That is, that Armenians sided with the Russians and were the ones picking them off all the way. Now, there is some truth to the fact that some Armenians did help. The Russian Empire at that point, particularly Russian Armenians, people who were in the Russian Empire. But that was not the reason for the loss. The loss was it was a very ill-conceived campaign, and the idea of marching into the Caucasus and continuing that in the winter is also completely insane. But nonetheless, it was the narrative that dominates his return. The fact that the reason why the Turkish army or the Ottoman army was defeated was because of Armenian betrayal. Now, very quickly after this, he comes back in January of 1915, or his retreat starts in January of 1915. In February of 1915, the Armenians are disarmed. In 1908, with the establishment of the constitutional government, Armenians for the first time were able to bear arms and serve in the Ottoman army. And they did. They fought on both fronts. All right, as they had loyally, in previous empires, they did fight for the Ottoman Empire on both fronts, and they were fighting in World War I on the side of the Ottoman Empire. In February 1915, they were disarmed and moved into labor battalions. That is, they were not able to bear arms anymore. What they had to do, because so many animals were killed, all right, they had to do the work of what they said the donkeys normally do. All right, so they would carry, they would carry munitions, they would carry building materials, but they were no longer able to actually fight. On April 8th, the Armenians of the area of Zeytun are told that they must leave that area. That it is no longer safe for them to be there, and they must leave the region of Zeytun. On April 19th, after some skirmishes, there are massacres particularly in Van, in the Van region, in which several thousand Armenians are killed. And then on April 24th, which today is considered the inauguration of the Armenian Genocide, the intellectuals in Constantinople, political leaders, church leaders, literary figures are rounded up, many of whom had come back in 1908, and brought out, and most of them executed. A couple of them made it out alive, but most of them are executed. Having cut off the head of the Armenian community, the Ottoman government then proceeded to cut off the body. Between April and August of 1915, nearly every single Armenian village was in deportation. By 1916, 1 million people had been killed. By 1923, 1.5 million had been killed, approximately. The number of displaced is unknown. The number of forced conversions is also unknown. But we're talking about here the radical elimination of the Armenian people from the Ottoman Empire. Sorry. Now, the numbers are one thing, and people will debate back and forth. It was actually a Turkish historian who was looking at the payrolls that noticed that in 1915, 800,000 Armenians disappeared. He doesn't believe there was a genocide. He just thinks 800,000 people disappeared from the tax rolls of 1915. But nonetheless, it's not just the numbers. The numbers are horrific enough. But what we have here, and it's important to note, is a paradigm for genocide. And people who studied the Holocaust, a lot of this will be familiar. Okay? First of all, there's a pattern to the extermination. This is not random killings in separate villages that don't have any connection. Okay? Every place we have pretty much the same sort of account given as to what happened. Men are gathered and held and marched out of town. At a short distance, most of them are shot or bayoneted. The men are normally shot within a short distance out of town, where it's out of ear range. Okay? People don't hear it or see it, but they were later discovered as they went on the march themselves. The elderly women and children were then forced to leave the town or the village. And then they were marched through the desert or taken in train cars. I'll talk about that. Normally along the Euphrates River at some points. You can see that is to a place called Deir Zor, which was the site of a concentration camp for the Armenian refugees. There are numerous accounts of survivors that are talking about, and even of locals, about how the Euphrates in some places changed course because the number of bodies had piled up so much that the river had to go a different way. And then in many places it ran red because of the number of victims who were in the river. Plus, there's simultaneity. Right? It's not only is there a pattern to the extermination, it happens simultaneously. As I said, the majority of the killings happened between April and August. All right, we're looking at approximately 200,000 people being killed a month. Okay, the majority of the deportations happen in this period. The rest of it is cleaning up, and it still keeps on going. But really, the majority of the genocide takes place in these short months, and it's happening at the same time. Okay? It's not just on the 6 border regions. When people say, well, it's only going to be, and then they said, the reason why we're doing this is because they're in the theater of war. All right? Or, some people say, well, they thought that they were, fifth column, so the ones that would be in the battle between between the Ottoman Empire and Russia, all right, they had to be taken out of the way so that they wouldn't betray them. Yeah, that becomes harder to believe as you see the scope of this. That it's not just in the border regions, but throughout all of the 6 provinces. The early deportations happen in Van and Erzurum. Then southern detachments start moving into Bitlis, Mush, Sassoon, Diyarbakir. I can move it into this direction here. Van, I think I'm pointing to Van, I can't see it either, in Erzurum. And then the northern detachments start hitting Kharkut, Sivas, and Marzavan. Okay, so throughout all 6 Armenian provinces, we have these deportations of Armenians, not just, let's say, where the major battles with Russia would be, but also here and in places like Trabzon, Ankara, the capital, or the present capital, it wasn't then, and other cities that are not in historical Armenia, right? And nowhere near where the war is being fought. And then the question also arises, why is it only the Armenians? They said that we'll relocate them for their own protection. What? The other population of Muslim Turks and Kurds does not need to be protected? They can be left open to the theater of war without a problem? So we can see this happening throughout the Armenian provinces and places of Armenian inhabitation throughout Anatolia. Armenians were denigrated. Right? This is one of the normal factors in any sort of genocide. They were thought of as a disease. They were treated as vermin. We have the same, they were a plague. They're like rats. Right? They can infect the Ottoman spirit. They will infect the Ottoman Empire. Right? Talat Pasha once said, when it was, as it was occurring, that they have to make sure that they kill every single Armenian, even a baby, so that they don't grow up and infect the empire or try and take revenge. The use of technology, right? One of the hallmarks also of the Holocaust, right? That made, it's not as though mass killings were unheard of in the past. There were plenty of times, but technological innovation made this a completely different experience and able to up the numbers to an incredible degree. So we have the use of the telegraph. Orders were telegraphed in, not by some guy on a horse trying to get across the country. They can now telegraph the orders right away, and they could be followed the very next day, not 3 months later. And Armenians were put into railroad cars. As I talked about that Berlin to Baghdad railways, where there were other railways being built off of that throughout the Ottoman Empire. And what a convenient way to move entire populations, but to pack them into boxcars and then drop them off in the middle of a desert. So we see the use of technology here as well. And the use of the concentration camp. And the idea that you can gather all of them up into one location and let them sort of rot and starve there. All right, so again, these are sort of hallmarks for the paradigm of genocide. We should remember the word genocide did not exist in 1915. And people say, well, nobody called it a genocide. There was a good reason why people didn't call it a genocide. It was because there was no word genocide. It was invented in 1944 by a Jewish-Polish jurist named Raphael Lemkin. You may have studied this in your class already. Based on his own studies of the Armenian genocide, as well as his own personal experience with the Holocaust. And this was a seminal event, obviously, in the study of genocide and hopefully for the prevention of genocide. But he himself suffered from the Holocaust. He made it to America. But in his own studies, and he himself were persecuted in Europe because he was studying the case of the Armenian genocide. Newspaper articles, though, and political papers did not use the word genocide, though, in 1915, right? They didn't have a word, right? But they do use phrases like mass killing, attempts at a total annihilation, extinction of a people. And here's a New York Times headline from 1915, American Committee on Relief says victims of Turks are steadily increasing. Policy of extermination. Okay? More atrocities detailed in support of charge that Turkey is acting deliberately. And so this is a newspaper headline from the New York Times. I'll refer to them again later. Come on. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. It is recognized as genocide by all these following institutions. Okay, the United States still does not officially recognize it as genocide. Obviously, the Republic of Turkey does not recognize that genocide has happened either, and I'll talk about this a little bit later on. But just so you know, the International Association of Genocide Scholars says it's genocide. This is not something that's really debatable. The American government and the Turkish government say it's a debated historical event, but it's not, according to people who specialty in genocide studies. Okay, let's look at the memory of the Armenian genocide, because this is actually a very interesting case. The immediate memory, what I mean by the immediate memory is almost as it's happening and in the years after it's happening, how did people see it? How did people recognize it? And the immediate memory is actually quite dramatic. In the U.S., nearly 200 articles appeared in the New York Times in 1915 to 1922 talking about the Armenian genocide. All right? You're not going to find anywhere near that many being talked about today having to do with the Armenian genocide. And it was important. People knew about it because of reports of the American ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, Henry Morgenthau. His family is still active in support of genocide recognition, having to do with the Armenian issue. And also because of Protestant missionaries who came back with tales that were horrific. And people were really moved by this. And in fact, this launched a massive relief effort. And maybe you've read about that also in the Burning Tigers by Peter Balakian, as he does a lot, he spends a lot of time on that, and justifiably. Also, Michael Babelian has brought this up as well. The American Committee for Relief in the Near East, which still exists today as the Near Eastern Relief Fund, was formed. Between 1916 and 1930, they raised $116 million in support of the Armenians. That's more than any other relief effort ever That's more than Live Aid, that's more than anything that went to Haiti, that's more than anything ever raised since. $1.5 billion in today's funds, if we're looking at it adjusted for inflation. Okay, massive effort, and it wasn't just America, too. Europe got involved. Italy, for example, the first Jewish Prime Minister of Italy, Luigi Luzzati, who had been friends with William Gladstone, had set up colonies in Italy to house Armenians who had been persecuted and fled. But America was really leading the charge. It was the largest relief effort ever. And there were politicians, former presidents, celebrities. Babe Ruth back was auctioned off in support of it, the Armenian genocide. So people knew about this. And how many of you remember learning about the Armenian genocide in high school? And I'm not seeing a large show of hands. I don't remember really learning. I remember World War I in high school. But everybody knew, right, in 1922 about the Armenian genocide. And this is one of the fascinating histories about the genocide itself. In 1930s, 1933, Franz Werfel published in German his famous book, The 40 Days of Musadah. That was quickly translated into English and into 34 other languages. And it was subsequently censored by the Nazi government in Germany. But it became so popular in America that MGM wanted to make a film about it. But it's a great story about how a bunch of Armenians are able to fight off Ottoman Turks trying to kill them, and at the end, against all odds, they manage to survive and they escape on a French vessel that saves them after courageous fighting, after being outnumbered. It was a great tale. It would have made a great movie. Turkish government called up and said, "You're not going to make that film." Or they called up the State Department and told them, "You're going to tell MGM you're not going to make that film." And the film was never made. And this is when we can see the veil of silence starting to fall on the Armenian genocide. If in the 20s and early 30s the Armenian genocide was one of the most known events of recent history, along with World War I, obviously, right? In the 30s themselves, as we move on, we can start to see forgetfulness overtaking memory. There's, until Hitler could say, right on the outbreak of World War II, who after all remembers the Armenians? Right, this would be his famous statement. And it's surprising when you look at what's going on in the 20s that, by 1940 somebody can say this. Who after all remembers the Armenians? Now, there are several reasons for this. Simple passage of time. We all know the intensity of relief efforts are highest immediately after the event. And one can say as we move along, we just tend to forget. Other things happen. The Great Depression, World War II. Right? If you're in Armenia, or in, let's say, other areas of Armenia, you have the Stalinist persecutions. In fact, Armenians couldn't talk about it in the Soviet Union. It was a crime against the Soviet Union because it was seen as a form of nationalist expression. So Stalin forbade anything to be said about the genocide, which was also important. And then there are more nefarious things along with that. It's the Turkish government starts to implement an official policy of denial, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. And the United States goes along with it as it starts to see Turkey as an ally and not as an enemy. As Turkey wisens up and realizes that the future of Turkey, right, will be much better if it's aligned with the United States and NATO, right, so too America starts saying, well, the Turks are not an enemy, they're an ally, and therefore why do we want to antagonize them by mentioning this sort of event that happened anyway in the Ottoman Empire? We'll talk about that in a second. So there are real reasons for why this happens. But you also have to remember, there are no memorials, no books, no speeches every year, right? Even within the community, there were things written in Armenian that people knew. And the people that survived sort of talked about it amongst themselves, but they didn't really have an open dialogue about this. And they didn't want to look back, they didn't want to talk about it. Right, so that veil of silence was, on the one hand, imposed from the outside. Some of it was just imposed by time, some of it was imposed by the outside, and some of it was internal. Some of it had to do with shame, that this had happened to them. They didn't want to go back there. I mean, I knew people who said that even if their children went back to Turkey, they would disown them. They wanted nothing to do with it. It was in the past, and they didn't want to touch it. So this silence descends upon the whole issue in the 30s and the 40s. But 1965 becomes a watershed year. 1965, the 50th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide. There are mass demonstrations in Yerevan in Armenia. All right, Stalin has died. All right, he's dead over a decade. He died in 53. Not that the situation is so much better. The Armenians who came out to protest or came out to demonstrate in favor of a memorial of the Armenian Genocide put their lives at risk. They knew that they could be killed for doing this. It was a legal political gathering. But they did it. They said, we can't keep quiet anymore. And this also opened up waves of recognition in America and elsewhere around the diaspora. If they could do it, why the heck are we in a free society not doing it? All right, so in 1965 also we have the first genocide memorial in America, Montebello, California. And the Armenian Genocide Memorial in Yerevan is completed by 1968. And there's now an Armenian Genocide Museum connected with that. But as Armenians become more and more outspoken about the issue of Turkish denialism becomes stronger and stronger. For a while they had been betting on the fact that it would just be forgotten. And they were pretty much right about that. But after 1965 they realized that would no longer be sufficient, that they couldn't just ignore it. So they start developing and rehashing older theories as to what actually happened. First of all, they denied, the first denial was that systematic atrocities occurred. Right? No, a couple of thousand Armenians died. Right? And most of them were killed because they had been fighting Turks. Right? So that was the first case. Eventually, however, they couldn't deny the numbers anymore. Turkish historians were coming up, as they said, with numbers that were high. All these Armenians have disappeared. We know these were Armenian towns. People are saying, look, there were all these Armenian churches. Where are they? They couldn't fool the whole world all the time. So they said, yes, a lot of Armenians died. Maybe 1 million, maybe 800,000. They tried to keep the number as low as possible, but it wasn't genocide. That's not, look, stuff happens in war. Do you know how many Turks were killed during the war? It was way more than the number of Armenians. Well, that's true. There were also more Russians killed in World War II than Jews that were killed. But that doesn't mean the Holocaust didn't happen. I'm sure, I don't know what that figure is on Germans. There were a number, I'm sure more Germans died in World War II than Jews as well. Doesn't mean the Holocaust didn't happen. Right? But nonetheless, this became the argument. They died in war. Some of them died, they said, that we relocated them to try to get out of the sphere of war. Things broke down. It was inadequately done. There was bad organization. People died. People left. Armenians killed a lot of Turks. And they sort of are trying to argue around it this way. There's also, Armenians deserved it, as they said, right? They rebelled, they weren't loyal, possible fifth column, they had it coming to them. As you can see, many of these arguments contradict each other, and that's also part of the course, because you have to, they try and keep you on different arguments all the time, so that you can't really, it's hard to make one effective argument, because they'll just shift it. And then there's discontinuity, which is also becoming very popular, not just in Turkey, but also elsewhere. It was the Ottoman Empire, not the Republic of Turkey. Sure, it was the framework of the government was the Ottoman. It was still called the Ottoman Empire. The Republic of Turkey was founded in 1923. But on the other hand, the entire population of the Ottoman Empire did not change between 1922 and 1923. Right? It's the people who were in power in 1923 and 1922, other than the members of the CUP who fled, Enver Pasha and Cemal, were still in power. The local people who helped have this happen were still there. Right? So yes, it is not the Republic of Turkey that committed this atrocity, but it's also not a completely different entity. And more importantly, the Republic of Turkey is founded upon genocide. And one of the reasons why Ataturk decides not to pursue this matter too far is because all of a sudden there is an instant way for Turks to have a middle class. Take over Armenian properties. It becomes very convenient right? To have all this abandoned property hanging around. So it's one way to reconstitute a Turkey. And it's also much easier now without Armenians to form a Turkey, right, for Turks. So the whole concept of a modern Turkey for Turks and its structure is built upon the elimination of certain minorities within the Ottoman Empire. And Turkey as a republic would look very different today if the genocide had not happened. So in that sense, there isn't a discontinuity. And their tactics have been blaming others. The Europeans forced the Ottoman Empire into this because they made them have so many concessions, and they tried to protect the Armenians, or the Armenians are to blame for it. We should just forget about it. It's happened a long time ago, and I'll get back to that issue. There's no point in digging this up again. Active attempts to stop others from mentioning it. If you're a scholar of Turkish studies and you talk about it, forget being able to go to Turkish archives. Right? There are also paid positions for academics to support a Turkish interpretation of the genocide. Politicians, obviously lobbying, very intense on that. And economic blackmail, for example, with the Republic of Armenia. There are many Armenians from the Republic of Armenia who work in Turkey. If the Republic of Armenia, which does not officially actually recognize the genocide in that way, right, comes out with a statement, or they say if the United States comes out with a statement, they'll send all those Armenians back to the Republic of Armenia overnight. And the Republic of Armenia cannot handle that influx of unemployed workers. Right, so they're asked not to push on the genocide issue as well. Okay, and then there's also the notion that, well, if we accept the genocide, Turkey is going to become Muslim fundamentalist because we're being denigrated and our pride is being hurt. And finally, somewhat, I think the worst, in some ways, not the worst, but definitely up there, is they say, we acknowledge the Holocaust. Alright? So we can't be genocide deniers. And if Jews like to know what's good for them, they won't push us to accept it, because all of a sudden we could change on the Holocaust. Right? And so they try to cater to Jewish groups to also deny the Armenian genocide. And some of them have bravely refused to do so. Right? By saying, look, we're friends of Jews and we accept the Holocaust. So they use all of these different tactics to promote this silence. Now, 1965 ushered in this sort of watermark year for Armenians awakening to the memory of the genocide, and as well as these Turkish denialists, but it also starts to bring in a period of self-discovery, right? And the Armenian genocide, and the idea of the genocide memoir. And interestingly enough, though perhaps not unexpectedly, it's not the survivors who start writing, it's the descendants of the survivors. And so, for example, in 1975, Michael Arlen wrote this book, A Passage to Ararat, which may be one of the earliest examples of this, of somebody who realizes he grew up, he doesn't really know what the genocide was. His father did not want to talk about it, did not talk about it. And he sees it as sort of this, ethnic concern that really, is beneath him. And it's a story about how he comes to understand the role of the genocide in his father's life, in his family's life, and in his life. And he won a National Book Award for that in 1976. And this was followed up by probably even more timely publication of Black Dog of Faith by Peter Balakian, that similarly talks about how growing up without any knowledge of the genocide, all of a sudden as an adult you realize this has happened to your family. This has been part of your narrative, and you've never really understood it. Because it's been hinted at, there have been remarks, but no one has bothered to tell you. Not that they haven't bothered, nobody wanted to tell you about what actually happened. And this came, fortunately for Armenian scholars, this book came out at a time when the memoir was just entering as I would say, a more popular form of narrative. Right? So rather than in 1975, I think Michael Arlen's book had an immediate impact, but Peter's book was able to have, I think, a greater impact because also the memoir, and now we have memoirs on everything, even dogs have memoirs. But nonetheless, this genre of literature has become more popular. And so when Peter's book came out, it made it able for Armenians then to tap into that. And there have been other works. My discussion is not by any means exhaustive by this, but I think these are two seminal works in the development. But it's interesting that it's not the actual survivors. It's not because they haven't written anything, and they did immediately afterwards, but in Armenian. And people, and I'll talk about this in a second, have manuscripts in their house that their grandparents wrote in Armenian that just were never published about what happened. And people didn't want to go there. Their grandparents didn't want to go there. They put it in their drawer, and then often by the second generation, they couldn't read Armenian anymore. Right? And so it just was kept in a drawer. But this, so it's the next generation that wrote about their self-discovery as survivors of the genocide. And I'll just mention, but now we've gotten also about the actual survivors themselves, and writing and getting that story out too. And then Peter Balakian has also translated that of his relative Grigoris Balakian, who was an archbishop of Marseille, who escaped on April 24th. He was able to get out. This was, again, originally written in Armenian. He co-translated it into English. All right, so we have that. And that's not it. We also have Ottoman Armenians' works have now been translated. There are still works to be done. Teotim's Monument to April 11th has been translated. And Lawrence Sherinian has a collection of survivor memoirs of the Armenian genocide. More and more now we're getting these sort of narratives, but this is a new phenomenon that'll enter in a new phase of the study. There are collections of oral histories throughout the country that are very important to us, and I did want to mention that there is a conference being held on April 2nd on oral history at UCLA. Oral Histories of the Armenian Genocide, in which there'll be scholars from Holocaust studies there as well. And if you guys get an opportunity to go down there, I would strongly encourage it. Project SAVE has been active in preserving photographs, another form of memory from the genocide and from before the genocide. And Ruth Tomaskin goes around to various Armenian communities and collects photographs from people to preserve them. And interestingly enough, even Turks, Osman Köker, has recently published a book about 100 years of Armenians, 100 years ago, Armenian presence in the Ottoman Empire, with postcards of Armenian places that are no longer there. This whole Armenian section was leveled, right? Or places that have been rededicated. And he hopes to follow this with a volume on, like, then and now. Pictures of what it was like 100 years ago, and then pictures now. Now, he himself doesn't use the word genocide, but he just wants people to draw their conclusions for themselves. So, conclusion. Why remember? This is one of the questions that people ask. It happened so long ago. And I've had very intelligent, caring people ask, look, it happened so long ago. Why don't the Armenians just move on, get on with their lives, right? And not pick at this old wound. Just forget about it. Move on. And don't look back. It doesn't do you any good to sort of hang back there. Well, first of all, I tell them Armenians have moved on. All right, this is important. In every single area where there's an Armenian diaspora, Armenians are successful. They have moved on. The Mexican ambassador to America is an Armenian. Right? He's of Armenian descent. Okay, Kirk Kerkorian, some of you may be familiar with. William Soroyan, the Armenian-American writer. We have in Paris and France, Charles Aznavour, the famous Armenian singer. They're all over and they're successful. So they have moved on. This has not kept them behind. But the other thing is, this is not the opening of an old wound. And that's the mistake. People presume that this is a wound that has been healed that Armenians are picking at, and that's not the case. The point is that nobody has ever said there is a wound. People still deny that the wound ever happened. And so there's been a group of people who have been walking around with an open wound that has never been looked at. And anybody who's been hurt knows before you can treat, before you can heal a wound, you have to acknowledge that it's there. And so acknowledgement of this fact, of remembering this fact, is the first step in healing it. Now, the healing process is painful. Everybody knows that. And it's not going to happen overnight. And it won't be complete until the actual fact of genocide becomes a memory. Thank you very much.
Do any of the students students have questions they'd like to ask? Yes.
What percentage of the Armenian nation was killed in the genocide?
Yeah, it's hard to tell. Again, we don't have the exact numbers, but if we presume there were about 2 to 3 million Armenians in the Ottoman Empire before 1915, and today there's a community of maybe 50 to 100,000. So then they weren't all killed. Obviously, a lot of them also fled. And we're looking at 1.5 million approximately killed, about half, maybe slightly more than half, and the rest of them were
The
deported.
whole world. I know you lost track of some of the Armenians that were more How many Armenians were there in the world in 1915?
I don't know how many Armenians there were in the world. I tell you the truth, I don't have a number on that. Today, there's still only, 7 to 10 million? So it wasn't a large number. But I would be completely hypothesizing 5 to 6, maybe. But again, I don't know. I'm sorry.
I want to thank Peter for I want to thank Sergio for outlining this history for us. We've seen some things, but this was so clear, and I also appreciate it greatly, and I hope you all do too, the clear way in which he explained to us how the Holocaust was not without precedent prior to its happening. Okay, see you all later.
Thank you.